The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, author and philosopher Mark Kingwell joins us to discuss why we should question authority, which also happens to be the title of his latest book. Then we revisit our conversation on technology's influence on geopolitics. That's all next on The Agenda. Question authority. Think for yourself. We've all heard these slogans before, but what happens when they go too far? What happens when they slide into a distrust of everything, from science to media to government? In his new book, Question Authority, a polemic about trust in 5 meditations, author Mark Kingwell offers his answer and a roadmap to getting trust back. He's also a professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto, and we are delighted to welcome him back to our studio. It's great to see you again.
It's great to see you, Steve.
Yeah, a long time.
Thank you
used to hang out in these parts for quite a bit.
I was on your culture panel for a long time.
On Studio 2, the previous show.
That's right.
Yeah, you were in here every week. Well, it's good to have you back. Let's dive in. You point out more people are going to cast electoral ballots in 2024 and next year, 25, than at any other moment in human history. And so far, if you look at what's happened in 2024, from 10 Western governments facing election this year, they all either lost or they all certainly lost vote share. That's the first time in more than 120 years of record keeping that that has happened. Question, what does that tell us about the political moment we are in?
Well, the two things. I mean, first of all, the stats about the super democracy year or period are remarkable. That would seem on the surface to indicate that it's a good time for democracy because a lot of people are going to the polls and exercising their franchise. But what we've seen so far is that there's a big pushback against incumbency. And to me, that suggests that there's a great deal of discontent with the current arrangement. And whether that means late capitalism in some kind of death throes, environmental and climate crisis, or simply just a kind of shift of thinking about the nature of government and the relationship of citizens to government, that really is going to take a long time to shake out. But this pushback against the incumbents is something that I think political theorists have to pay a lot of attention to, and politicians should be worried about.
You know, I remember having our current UN ambassador, Bob Ray, in that chair many years ago, and we tried to talk political theory about why, you know, this party loses and that party wins and so on. And he said, you know, sometimes it's possible that just at the end of the day, the folks want the ins outs and the outs ins.
Yeah.
Does it get more complicated than that?
I don't think it does at some level. You know, it's, but the problem is that, say goodbye to the old boss, here's the new boss. And people think that they're getting change by exercising this kind of choice to get rid of, you know, kick the bums out. It's not necessarily going to change in the ways that they want. So I think if you look at you know, everyone's focused on the American election. What is that vote about? A lot of things, but one is certainly a discontent with the way things are seen to be arranged. And that would mean not just Washington and inside the Beltway politics, but just the idea of government having a kind of say in people's lives. So a lot of it is just discontent, unfocused until you get in front of that ballot box and then you say, you know what, I don't like this guy or this woman. I'm going to vote for something different or what I imagine is different.
Having said that, you write the remarkable thing about human societies is that they function at all. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think we should always remember this. First of all, go back to the original point. Isn't it amazing that so many people even have the capacity to vote and that they are allowed to have a say in how their daily affairs are ordered?
It's a relatively new phenomenon
in
world
is.
history.
Yeah,
yes.
we forget about this. I mean, we tend to think of political history in terms of maybe decades, but we should think of it more in terms of centuries. The liberal idea, the idea that we can disagree about certain fundamental things but still live together peaceably, that idea is only about 400 years old in terms of its influence on the Western world. It's an achievement, and it's a fragile achievement. So the franchise itself is a great thing to see. We have to, of course, abide by the results, and the results sometimes can be unsettling. They can even be self-defeating. That's what I think a lot of people worry about. Democracy can become its own enemy. But one of the reasons I wrote this book was to try to highlight some of the things that start out as good intentions, wanting to be informed and have your authorities transparent to you, to justify power, not just exercise it, and how that desire for justification and transparency can sometimes turn around on itself.
I suspect we could have a great debate about what the greatest invention of all time was. Everything from the iPhone to the screw, which is a pretty important invention as well. However, I mean, if you read this book, you might think that the invention of trust is the greatest invention of all time. You want to put that on the record?
Sure. I mean, trust is a technology, first of all. I think that's one good way to think about it. It is driven by human desire, our need to have certain goods made possible that we can't achieve alone. And so we need to trust. Trust then becomes evolutionarily adaptive because it allows us to accomplish goals and survive challenges that we couldn't do otherwise. In that sense, it's the basis of institutions, of functioning bureaucracies, of exchanges, contract. So anything that's really basic to human interaction has an element of trust in it.
Would you go so far as to say that without trust in the institutions, which are the foundation of democracy, democracy must fail?
Yes, I would absolutely say that. And I think that's one of the reasons we have this focus on critical trust deficits in institutions. And we can take them institution by institution. One of the reasons I started writing this book was to try to focus sector by sector, media, politics, academia, science, public health, and try to see how the trust in those institutions or the structures that govern those aspects of life had eroded over time and why. And of course, that's an encyclopedia all by itself, just detailing, providing the evidence of that crisis of trust. So I wanted to move then to a kind of critical analysis. Why is this happening? Why are people losing trust in institutions? And what can we do about it? So that's really what this book is about.
We're going to get to the what can we do about it in a second, but let me follow up on that last point. We seem to be in a time which is really different from, say, when we were kids, where you actually did have a pretty good amount of trust in some of the bigger institutions that kind of governed your world. But that's all been, I don't know, but all. So much of it has been replaced today by our trust in our tribe. We only care about what's happening in our tribe, and we don't want to know from anything else. How problematic is that for democracy?
Well, very much so. And you know, it highlights a couple of interesting things. One is that trust often functions best when it's invisible. So, you know, to call it a technology would seem to suggest, oh, it's a tool in front of us on a table, a workbench or something like that. That's not how it works. It works by being a kind of implicit arrangement, an attitude, and I would even argue eventually a kind of psychology of being in the world, whereby we can engage in activities with an expectation that they're going to work out for everybody. So what happens is when that expectation is not there, or if it's put into question, there's a knock-on effect, kind of rippling out of dysfunction. And getting back to the point where trust is functional and invisible is very hard. Tribalism and a kind of shrinking of the trust basis is definitely a danger. Again, this is a positive achievement of the last few centuries, that we could have radically decentralized societies where I don't need to know who you in particular are. I'm on the subway or I'm in a public space. I don't want to even know who you are. You're a stranger to me. But we have certain relationships that are embedded in the institutions that surround us. And you know, this kind of estrangement is actually a great possibility, but it means that the countervailing force is retreat to the community, the tribe, the family, and ultimately to oneself and one's own opinions, which become, for some people, the only authority there is.
We love the Mark Twain line, don't we? About statistics. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. So let's put some stats on the record here. Sheldon, you want to bring this up here? This is according to the Edelman 2024 Trust Survey. They come out with this every year. 60% of Canadians worry government leaders are purposely trying to mislead them. 60%. That's up 7% from the year before. And what about us in the Fourth Estate? 55% think the same of journalists, and that's up 5% from 2023. And we'll follow up with a quote from your book, Mark. We live in a time when many of the strongest habits we have are bad. Bad for us, bad for others, bad for the environment, bad for politics, bad for everything we care about. But humans are creatures of habit, and breaking harmful ones is hard work. All right, let's get into it. What are these bad habits we're having trouble with?
Well, the interesting thing to me is that it starts with a good habit, which is what's sometimes called epistemic autonomy. So the idea is that think for yourself, and that you shouldn't simply go along with something that somebody tells you just because they tell you. That's a virtue. And it's a virtue in the Aristotelian sense that it needs a cultivation over time. So you get into the habit of thinking for yourself, and then you get better at it. The problem is that epistemic autonomy starts to erode another equally important thing, which is epistemic humility. That sometimes you don't know what's going on, and you should defer to authority, because every time you think that you're right, you might be proven exactly wrong.
And both are in incredibly short supply today.
Well, both are, and that's really interesting. And they both have this deep root in, both of them you could say are as old as Socrates. Socrates says, challenge authority, but he also says, I know that I'm ignorant. So, we get the famous psychological case is the so-called Dunning-Kruger effect, where people constantly overestimate their expertise at certain things. And, the idea that if the plane is in trouble, I could probably land it if I had to. Most of the time when we think we can do things, we can't. And there are people who are better at many of the things that we think we're good at. So this balance between autonomy and humility is really hard to achieve. And again, I think that the notion of habit or virtue as habit is really helpful here, because you get into a kind of balance, a mean between these excesses. So yeah, you're questioning authority when it's appropriate to do so, but you're also deferring to authority when, for example, take the recent pandemic, you really don't know the science better than the scientists do. And you might think you do, but you don't.
But we're addicted to conviction.
Well, that's another problem. Yeah, and it's in the background of all of this. I call this addiction to conviction doxaholism, from the Greek word for opinion, doxa. And I think it's an appropriate way to think of it as an addiction, because, first of all, addiction literature, thinking about addiction is very close to our contemporary discourse. We have addiction issues of all kinds. I'm suggesting that everybody might be prone to addiction to conviction, because there are payoffs in the short term. I get to feel right. I get to have my biases confirmed. I get to make sharp lines between in-group and out-group. So there's reward to thinking that you're right. But there's all kinds of downsides that eventually come to light.
There are politicians all over the world, and Donald Trump, of course, is just the most recent example of it, who have managed to convince people that the game is rigged, that you don't have a chance, the system is unfair. If you're mad as hell and you don't want to take it anymore, you are justified to feel that way because, let's face it, you don't have a chance. Now, they're not completely wrong about that, are they?
Well, no, and it's funny you use that language, because it reminds me, I talk about it in the book, Peter Finch's performance in Network, where he's actually going mad, but the moment at which he breaks out and shouts, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore, it becomes a rallying cry. People are opening their windows in Manhattan apartment buildings and screaming it into the street. I think we can all relate to that. The problem is, and Trump again is a flashpoint, an exemplar, if not actually a cause. When you think the game is rigged, then the only sane position to take is to grift harder than the other guy, and to be a better con artist than the con artist. And that is toxic. That's a classic collective action problem, a race to the bottom. Every time you try to get advantage that way, you erode the game, and you make the game worse for everybody, including yourself. So we all lose for your winning. But the competition is almost irresistible in some cases, because it starts with this idea that I'm not going to be conned anymore. Well, you know what? Pump the brakes a little bit. Maybe it's not a con if somebody in the media say, are they deliberately trying to change your mind or make you think something? Well, doubtful. But even if they are, use your mind and fight back. Think for yourself. Right? But if it's vaccinations, for example, maybe you should defer to public health experts, because vaccinations are a public good.
Well, there's going to be a new Health and Human Secretary, Health and Human Services Secretary in the United States.
So the thinking's going to shift on that.
Well, it's going to be interesting what happens there. And you know, on the one hand, yes, question authority, as you point out. It's a good thing in a democracy. On the other hand, are we at a point right now where the critics have just gotten so good and the monetizing of outrage has gotten to be just such a fundamental part of everything that that we can't do anything anymore?
Well,
does it feel that way sometimes?
It certainly feels that way sometimes. I don't think it's a feeling that we should indulge too far, because that feeling of helplessness or of the game being totally corrupted is exactly the kind of outcome that, you know, the real grifters like. Because that's when you take advantage, when everybody thinks that there is no profit in playing by the rules, that you're a dupe if you believe in anything. This is the collapse of you know, human civilization, really. Because to go back to the earlier point, if we can't trust one another, we can't build things. We can't do things together. And that starts from, you know, even the smallest kind of cooperative task to the largest.
On the other hand, Mark, look who's going to be president of the United States come January 20th. And I'm not saying this to be critical. It's an empirically provable fact that he has not played by the rules at basically any stage of his life, and he's going to be the president again. Yeah. What lesson are we to take from that?
Well, come on. I mean, those are dark days. Those are dark facts. I mean, I wrote most of this book before in fact, the book was released officially on U.S. Election Day, which was also Guy Fawkes Day, if you want to, you know, do the thing. But and I remember at the time when he was convicted of the felony charges, and I went back and I changed the manuscript to every descriptor. Instead of ex-president, I changed it to convicted felon. And I took great satisfaction for about 15 minutes in doing that. All of the things, the standards of behavior and accountability that we used to take for granted are up for account. They are, I think this is an opportunity, though. I want to be optimistic that we have to go back to basics and rethink all of these things and say, why did almost, you know, or more than half the United States population who vote for this person who is manifestly unqualified? Well, there's a crisis there. And if we're at a critical point, maybe, you know, maybe the critics are right that this is a tectonic shift. Liberal democracy is over. We're into some kind of post-liberal, post-national, post-something condition. I don't think so. I think this experiment of liberalism, where we can live together and we can have functional institutions, I think this experiment continues.
You like the Matrix, eh? You like the Matrix movies? You use the metaphor in the book, you know? Take the red pill, you're going one way. Take the blue pill, you're going another way. Do you see similarities between critics of authority on both the left and the right? You're nodding yes, but they're different, right? They are different in some ways.
They are different, but the similarity is striking because the red pill idea, which comes from the Matrix, has become a widespread right-wing meme, trope. And the idea is that you take the red pill because you want to see things correctly. You want to see reality as it is. And so then you are based in the language of the right, which is directly opposed to what the language of the left, which is you are woke. Although these days, anybody who uses woke is probably writing for the National Post or something. It's a debased word, but woke versus based becomes a handy way of looking at both of these are programs of seeing through, punching through appearance to reveal reality. And insofar as they're projects of revelation, they have the same energy. But what they're claiming to reveal is different in each case. Systematic this, systematic that. The basic impulse is, again, as old as Plato. You know, you'd find it in Plato's cave. The shadows on the wall are not real. We have to find really real things, right? And it's not just the things that are being projected onto the wall. That's just ideology. We have to get out of the cave altogether. That idea of revelation as a kind of seeing through or punching through is very basic to our thinking. I prefer to think that the impulse of both the based and the woke, the red pill and the other tropes, what they really should be engaging in is immanent critique. Look at what's going on inside yourself and in your own thinking. This idea of punching through, it's very seductive, but it has this problem that it can go in almost any direction. And so that's the thing. I mean, I happen to believe that the red pill movement is more dangerous than allegedly woke things, partly because I think this wokeness is over-described. But in both cases, there is a logic that is tempting and yet dangerous.
America seems quite steeped at the moment in red versus blue pill thinking. How about in Canada? Are we?
Yeah, I think so. To a lesser extent, the interesting thing about political discourse in Canada has always been its susceptibility to American ideas and trends. And we see that especially in the long wake that Trump is putting, not just on us, but the rest of the world. So a figure like Pierre Poilievre is figured and maybe wants to figure himself as a kind of quasi-populist. Canadian populism...
He rejects that, though. You know that.
I know he does, but he can't help it almost, right? He's being pushed in that. I wanted to say Canadian populism of the history that I remember is left-wing.
It's all NDP, CCF.
Right. Yeah, CCF, right? Prairie populism. Yeah. And I mean, that's the tradition that I grew up in politically. So I think that's still part of the Canadian zeitgeist, the political awareness. I hope it's, there's a lot of yammering, right? The social media, we haven't even talked about the politics and the dangers of social media, but there's a lot of puffy discourse, and I think the realities are not as extreme.
Here's a quote from the book. Trust becomes impossible when there is even suspicion that an institution is beholden to a political agenda. Do you think Canadian institutions are now beholden or captured by an ideology?
To some degree they are. I think there's valid criticism of the CBC as a national broadcaster, and it's apparent to some. I quote Tara Henley, who is a media critic, former CBC employee, who has detailed her argument about left-wing capture in the CBC.
We should just say, when people say that about the CBC, they really mean English language television.
That's right. And that's a very good point, because the very idea of a national broadcaster in this country itself is a remarkable achievement. Once again, something that we would not want to simply dismantle or get rid of. That it's the thing that historically has stitched the country together and continues to in some ways. So even if there is amounts of capture, ideological capture here and there, the institution itself is more important than that. And I think that's one kind of class of argument about the media. I think that you could say the same thing about academia, which is often classed in as an institution that's been ideologically captured. And sure, there's a lack of viewpoint diversity in some academic circles, but academia has often seen itself as a critic of the established order. And so it's not surprising that you're going to get people who are more reform-minded or radical than you would in the rest of the population.
How many philosophers in your department at University of Toronto?
Oh, we have a big department, like 80 people.
How many?
80.
How many do you think are conservative?
Yeah, very few. Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
So people are reasonable to
to
wonder where all that's going.
And but I would also say I don't think in a lot of philosophical investigation it matters what your politics are. I mean, I'm a political theorist, so political philosophy, of course it matters. But if you're doing analytic epistemology, I don't think your politics actually come into it.
Okay, moving on to this. On the right, groups like QAnon, it's easy to see the connection to outright conspiracy theory and that nothing seems as it is. QAnon, I don't know, for my taste, QAnon's a little out there. I suspect you feel the same way about it. Yeah. We don't see that degree, I don't think, of conspiracy thinking on the left as we do on the right. How come?
How come? I'm not sure about that. I agree that there's certainly a lot of systemic thinking on the left, right? The left is interested in things like unconscious bias, systemic racism. Those can feel conspiratorial in the sense that they're institutional. But the conspiracy, the actual idea of a conspiracy, that there is some directing intelligence or some group and a secret cabal somewhere, that does seem to be more favored on the right. And I think it goes back to, in American politics anyway, it goes back to kind of anti-government thinking, anti-intellectual thinking that is long supported by these outlier groups. So I suspect that the conspiratorial impulse takes on this kind of anti-government quality, but then it's the anti-everything quality, right? So the one thing I would say is that conspiracy thinking does, to some degree, appear to look like critical thinking that you see on the left. So critical social theory or critical legal theory, critical race studies, that can look to people like a kind of conspiracy theory. And I don't think it is, because I don't think those systemic or institutional analyses are actually saying there's some secret cabal.
Mind you, I remember Barry Zwicker, the media commentator, a pretty left-wing guy coming at things from the progressive point of view. He was in that chair saying 9/11 was an inside job.
Yeah. That's so weird to me. I mean,
yes, I know. Sure.
I mean, the other thing, to go back to the larger question of epistemic humility, what counts as proof to people? Mm-hmm. I think this is part of what I wanted to address in the book. What do you believe and how do you believe it? And we can talk about media trustworthiness and sources, but people's fundamental reflection about the state of their own knowledge is largely imperfect. People don't think about why they think things. And I know that sounds kind of second order, third order philosophical, but you need to do it. If you're going to go around the world as a political actor, you have to ask yourself why you believe things.
Well, how do we, I often heard people describing what's been going on in the United States over the past year as a fever. And for those who thought Donald Trump was a disease and a fever, they thought a Harris victory would break the fever and we'd go back to a kind of a more normal kind of politics. Yeah. Didn't happen. So what's going to break the fever in your view?
Well, there is this sense that polarization feeds its own dysfunction, that the kind of the raising of the temperature enhances the incentive for other people, a kind of perverse incentive to enhance their own temperature. That's true. So that counts as a fever. To break a fever like that, I think it really is a matter of obviously, institutional change would have been a good thing. So administration of a more sane type would have been very good for the great republic to the south. That's not going to happen. Then you have to start falling back to institutional guardrails, regulatory controls. Is that going to happen? That's a big question right now. People are looking at the cabinet choices, for example, and wondering if there's going to be a complete gutting of these institutional guardrails. And then on the level of individual citizens, you have to not give up. I think there's a clear danger of what some people call self-exile or interior exile. You know, I'll just become a kind of refusenik of the political order. But that's not a responsible form of citizenship. It might be a luxury that we indulge too much in Canada because we're right next door and we can say, oh, you know, we're not prone to that fever. We're you know, healthier and saner up here.
Well, you mentioned health. I'll pick up on that and let's finish on this. So when the new head of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., talks about wanting to take the fluoride out of the water, making vaccinations voluntary, making suggestions that people are that there's more autism nowadays because of vaccinations that people have taken. The appropriate response to all of that is what? Look
to the evidence, right? I mean, it's got to be evidence-based, whatever your decision is. And that's the one place or the one manner in which we can balance these goals of being autonomous, questioning authority, asking for transparency, wanting to see the proof, and also being humble. Maybe I don't know everything about vaccinations just because I don't want to wear a mask or don't want to have someone tell me I have to wear a mask. That's not a good enough basis for having an anti-vax theory. You need proof.
You've been at this 3 decades, eh? Writing yes. these books and getting us to think about these big things?
Yeah.
Good on you, man. This one's called Question Authority, a polemic about trust in 5 meditations. Mark Kingwell has been our guest. Great to see you again. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks a lot.
In an era of rising global tensions, coupled with the increasing digitization of economies and societies, to what extent will new technologies like artificial intelligence play in the geopolitical quest for power? Let's ask. In Syracuse, Italy, George Takash Senior Fellow at the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary History at the U of T, and the author of Cold War 2.0, Artificial Intelligence in the New Battle Between China, Russia, and America. In Washington, D.C., Rachel Ziemba, Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Center for a New American Security and lecturer at New York University's Center for Global Affairs. And here in studio, Besma Momani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo, Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation, and somebody who just drove 2 hours to get here. You are brave to brave our traffic. So well done. Thank you for being here, Besma, once again. George and Rachel, great to have you on our program tonight. George, I want to start with you because the title of your book, Cold War 2.0, suggests, obviously, we're in the middle of a second Cold War. Why do you think?
Well, in terms of geopolitics, a couple of the leading autocracies in the world, specifically China and Russia, and their junior partners, Iran and North Korea, have dragged us into this Cold War because those autocracies are no longer willing to comply with the rules-based international order. And what that has produced, the tsunami of cyber attacks, ransomware attacks, including against hospitals in Ontario, public libraries in Ontario, and then waves of disinformation into social media in Ontario and Canada. We're seeing economic coercion by these autocracies against the democracies. Hostage diplomacy, we saw that with the two Michaels. And then finally, in terms of the Cold War, China is launching all sorts of gray zone military punishment drills around Taiwan, which is a critical democracy. And then, like in the first Cold War, you had regional hot wars, and we've got a big one currently in Ukraine by Vladimir Putin. And we've got Iran sowing and fomenting military war in the Middle East.
So people are wondering why we're covering this story here. The answer is because it hits home. It definitely hits home for us. Rachel, I wonder if you could pick up on that answer and, maybe add to the list of when we talk about the technological changes that are sweeping across the globe and affecting us in this way, what other types of technology do we need to know about?
Sure. So in addition to all these risks that George has laid out very well, we're also seeing countries, including Canada, really looking to leverage new technologies and develop, sort of drive growth. Oil producing countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who might sometimes be seen as junior partners of either the US or China, are really putting a lot of money into sort of AI and tech development. We are seeing increasing technology in automotive supply chains and all of the sort of, in really any supply chain we're looking at, even metals, mining, oil and gas industries that are so important to Canada. This is increasingly ones where geological data and a variety of things are being used. And the risk is, as you have these different actors, that some of these critical supply chains could be tampered with, not only by hackers, but a variety of that. So I think this is something that is affecting both from a risk side, but also an opportunity side, us here in Canada and around the world.
Besma, this collision between tech and geopolitics, we've heard some examples from George. You want to, I don't know, anything else on your list you think we ought to know about that we need to add to it?
I definitely add chips, semiconductors. This is really where I think things really hit home. We talked a little bit about supply chains, and you heard that. And this really started when, frankly, COVID hit, and we started to become really aware of the word supply chains. It became common dinner conversation, frankly. And it really raised awareness on the vulnerability of what we used to think was just-in-time delivery, really this idea that globalization, being unfettered, worked for us. And then all of a sudden, not only are we scrambling for masks, which we did, we're scrambling certainly for, all things PPE, and not to forget the fact that chips were a big component of that and that they were really just not available. And we have a system today where a lot of our consumer products are smart. I mean, once you say smart, it's, you know, the Internet of Things. They're connected online. They need chips. And so washing machines have chips now in it. So it's become ubiquitous in all of our consumer goods. And so what COVID did, is really opened our eyes to this vulnerability and this nationalism of making sure that our supply chains are secure and safe, and just-in-time delivery no longer sufficed, not for the average person, and certainly not for policymakers. And it became suddenly a national security interest. And so geopolitics and national security really came to light, I think, because of COVID. Not to say that it hadn't preceded that with Trump's trade wars, which he started with China initially back in 2018, but it just hit home. And lastly, I'm going to put in there is populism. Let's not forget, because at the end of the day, this idea of relying on external sources, this idea of relying on unfettered globalization, just no longer was something that I think the average public was going to put up with. And populist leaders today are more likely to blame external foes, the external actors. And so we're doing a lot of China bashing in common parlance of a lot of policymakers. And that's really, I think, what has highlighted. So I'd focus on chips. It's really the ubiquitous thing in all of our consumer goods. And it's going to mean we are currently in a chip war, very much, as George pointed out, a reason for part of the Cold War 2.0.
I was going to get to this later, George, but since Besma pointed out, how do you see this thing changing or not as a result of the election of Donald Trump? And does it kind of go on steroids now, or what happens?
Well, just to bring together everything that we've already mentioned, ground zero for geopolitics and technology, and specifically chips, as Besma pointed out, is Taiwan. 92% of the advanced semiconductor chips in the world today are made on this small island called Taiwan. It's no bigger than Vancouver Island. TSMC, the leading chip manufacturer, is heavily into Taiwan. 14 plants. I was there about a year ago, and it's really an astounding place. And Donald Trump is ambivalent as to whether he's going to come to the defense of Taiwan, because China, 160 kilometers, that's all, away from Taiwan across the Taiwan Strait, China says that Taiwan belongs to China, and Taiwan has other thoughts. So this will be a huge litmus test for the new administration in Washington. Is will Donald Trump and his new Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, will they say and do the right things to make sure that deterrence is being affected vis-a-vis Taiwan and its chip manufacturing capability?
Rachel, you're at the center of it all right now, Washington, D.C. Do you have a view or a feeling about how Donald Trump will handle that when that crucial moment comes for him to make a decision about this? You know, he loves his relationship with President Xi. So how do you see this rolling out?
Well, he does, but they didn't part on good terms at the end of the Trump administration, right? The start of 2020 not only was the beginning of COVID and that scramble Besma was just talking about, but it was also when they signed what was the Phase 1 trade deal, where China agreed they were going to buy all sorts of U.S. products in exchange for lifting tariffs. And by the end of it all, they ended on very poor terms. So I do think, one of the things Trump has pledged on day one is tariffs on China. Maybe it won't be day one, but it'll be pretty soon. And I think that question mark, not only of what's the signal sent over Taiwan, but also other hotspots in Asia. And, the Biden, if anything, I think we're already on steroids in terms of focusing on using economic warfare and tools to support these supply chains. One of the big questions going forward is going to be the balance between protecting existing key nodes in semiconductors and technology and the U.S. focus to try to bring more of that production home, right? The Biden administration, supported by Congress, allocated a lot of money to convince TSMC and other producers to produce in the United States. Secretary of the House, Johnson, recently said, maybe we'll cancel that. We'll use the money for something else. So I think this is going to be a key question mark. And it's going to be a key area for allies of the U.S. like Canada to think about where do they fit into some of these supply chains. So there's geopolitics and national security risk, but economic security, economic growth, reshoring, these economic imperatives are also part of the picture now. And it's, I think, I think that Donald Trump's penchant for deal making, for negotiating, for threatening tariffs, for threatening restrictions, makes him a harder one to predict, perhaps. But we're already seeing a U.S. administration that is very fixated and focused on these supply chains, and I don't think that's going to change.
Besma, Canada came up in that answer, so let me follow up with you on that. Federal government made a decision to get rid of TikTok. Big deal, little deal? What do you think?
It's interesting, certainly. I mean, look, I think what we've seen in the past few years in thinking about technology as a risk is the big question. There are absolutely national security issues, without a doubt. And I think, there is some reason for us to have a lot of concerns about what were illegal technology transfer to a lot of these countries. And stealing, I mean, that's what it was. It was not sort of sign on the dotted line. It was really stolen from us, and we continue to see that as a real threat. So it's understandable, but the challenge here is that we've heard for too often, and I think the Americans have put this kind of aptly, this idea of having a small yard high fence. And the idea was, we're not trying to stop all globalization, because that's just not doable. We know that's not the case. But what we're trying to do is really focus on really specific things, and ironically, chips is just one of the many great things. We're seeing that in solar, we're seeing that in EV, a number of other technologies. But the problem is, you come to someone like Donald Trump coming to power, does not know what that concept entails. He really sees not just a big yard, tall fences, and lots of bravado. And so anything can happen. And the Chinese have been working vehemently to try to really increase their capacity, particularly in the semiconductor space, because that's not only those consumer goods that I talked about, but it's really the core of artificial intelligence. If they're going to succeed in the next wave of all things from not just military, but also civilian use, they really need to be ahead of the game in all things AI. And so that really is a big part of it. And I think what we're going to see with Trump coming to power is that bull in the China shop approach again. And so the Chinese are going to be even more worried now about what's next, right? What next are the Americans going to bring in to put those tariff wars in? So again, TikTok, it's just tip of the iceberg. And too often, I think we are looking at some of these applications with a lot of suspicion. I don't know how much TikTok really is of great national security value. Certainly geo.
Can you have it?
No, I don't have it. Yeah. I don't have it personally.
We're banned from having it here too.
Well, look, I mean, one of the things on that is the location services, right? It tells you where you are. And there's something really worrisome about the algorithm of TikTok. It's not clear. Some of the other social media, platforms are more clear about the kind of algorithm that's given to you. That's not the case with TikTok. And just one last thing. Really interesting, in China, ByteDance, the equivalent, there it's all about bettering yourself. The entire content and algorithm that's being pushed for the average young person, a TikTok user, ByteDance in China, is about how to be a better person, how to be smarter, how to work harder. That's not the case that we're having here in Canada and the West. So there's something really fundamentally odd about that. And back to disinformation, using cyber cognitive warfare, you can't help but wonder, what is the Chinese real strategy here in pushing this kind of nonsense content that we see in TikTok today?
This one for you, George. Is it fair to say that these technological rivalries are broadly divided by, I guess, the countries promoting liberal, human rights-centric governance models versus those deploying technology to support authoritarianism? Can we sort of break it down in that way?
Yeah, and that's precisely the frame that I use in the book. I think there's actually real value for people to understand what's going on by thinking about the democracies and the kinds of rules that we have, the commitment to human rights, the commitment to the rule of law, which do not exist in China currently. They do not exist in Russia. So just actually to meld your latest question with the TikTok one, I'm not on TikTok. I go on it periodically for research purposes. And if you put in your request for information on democracy, you'll get 15 short videos 12 of which are absolute, pure Beijing propaganda. And what I say in my book is going to happen, and I see it happening every day, is a decoupling of the technological infrastructure of the world into, to use your earlier phrase a second ago, a democracy-oriented tech ecosystem and an autocracy tech ecosystem. And just as you cannot get a whole raft of democracy-type internet platforms in China, we should not be having TikTok in Canada, in the United States, in Europe. And I totally agree with Besma's point about geolocation. The other danger in TikTok, beyond the propaganda and the geolocation, is there is a constant stream of data going back to China, potentially. They say they've got it offshore somewhere in Singapore, but potentially to China. And it's the same with EV cars from China. To pick up on Besma's earlier phrase, anything that's smart creates a data trail. Consumers in the democracies should not have their data exposed to access by oppressive autocratic governments. So yes, there will be this decoupling just at the technological level. You'll still be able to get all sorts of goods, merchandise, and Canadian Tire and Walmart and so on. But when it comes to technology and smart devices, unfortunately, we have to separate the world now.
I wonder, Rachel, whether you think we have the right either regulations or protocols or whatever in place to, I guess, enjoy and accelerate the benefits of what we're talking about here and mitigate against the risks that some of these new technologies present. What do you think?
I think we need to get the balance right. And in some ways, the TikTok ban is an example of where it's really tough to do it. I think Besma and George both highlighted the risks. But what's notable from the new rule, as I understand it, is that the marketing operations in Canada, that added jobs in Canada, has been what's banned. And Canadians can still download TikTok, they can still use it. So the data security, the data tracking elements are still present, right? Now, I mean, and that's a government balancing act, I anticipate, around not wanting to take something away from Canadians that people are deriving value and comfort from, right? But I think it is an example of how difficult that is. What, George's point about data and the data trail is really important. And this is something where I think even democracies differ in what they think the right rules are. Canada and European countries are among those that have pushed more for data localization than in the United States.
George, I wonder whether you think Canadian businesses traditionally think deeply at all about geopolitics.
Well, right now, they all need to be thinking very, very seriously about what's euphemistically called a Taiwan Strait contingency. What happens if China does move militarily against Taiwan? So if you have any supply chain emanating from or coming through Taiwan, and beyond semiconductor chips, Taiwan makes a lot of other products, the flat panel displays, the Kindle reader, the Kobo reader, like a lot of those products come out of Taiwan. So you've got to think through, well, do I have a second source? Do I move some production to Malaysia or Mexico? But then you also need, frankly, a China strategy, because if China moves on Taiwan, and if Trump does move to defend Taiwan, and I think Japan will be there as well, the best war games tell us that a lot of soldiers are going to die very, very quickly, unfortunately. And when body bags start going back to the States, that's when you'll get the full decoupling of trade between China and the democracies. And if you're a Canadian importer of whatever product, even a very low-tech product, and your sole source of supply is China at that point, you're going to be hurting. And Besma's reference to COVID teaching us some of these lessons, those lessons really need to be learned hard now, because frankly, I think the next 2 years could be critical for some activity in Asia that impacts adversely those supply chains. So you've got to think it through now.
George, you didn't see this, but in the midst of that answer, Besma started shaking her head, and that always catches my attention. So what was the head shake about?
I don't think Trump is defending Taiwan. Absolutely not.
He's not going to.
No, and I think actually we've accelerated the possibility that China will actually do something in Taiwan because, Taiwan was called, at one point because of its preeminence role, as George pointed out, in the semiconductor industry, that it had a silicon shield by virtue of what it does. But ironically, what we've seen under the Biden administration with the CHIPS Act is really make China, force it to accelerate its production and its knowledge of how to fabricate them themselves. So what we have today, in fact, is less reason. I mean, the silicon shield wasn't just about the world worrying about Taiwan. Even China was dependent on Taiwan for those chips. It's no longer the case. It's broken through already and is able to do that on its own. And so I think the probability of China attacking is higher than it was before the CHIPS Act. And I think Trump, as an actor, is not going to run to defend Taiwan. I really don't think he's interested, certainly especially if the Middle East gets hot and Ukraine gets hot. This is the furthest thing, I think, from his mind.
In which case, Rachel, as Canadian businesses try to consider their futures and how events a half a world away can have an impact on them, how incumbent is it upon them to start thinking more geopolitically about this world and how they run their affairs?
I think it's essential, both in the Taiwan contingency we've been talking about, but I think Canadian businesses have already had to think about, could products they're producing now end up in Russia, right? Could they end up in military and drones in Iran? So I do think there's been this wake-up call, over the last several years that around the world, Canadian businesses, other businesses, they have to pay attention to their supplier's supplier and their buyer's buyer. Canada has brought in forced labor restrictions. The enforcement is a lot weaker, perhaps, and other challenges than the sort of similar measures in the United States and in Europe. But I do think that businesses are being forced to really understand their supply chains and to make sure they're not running afoul of some of these rules. And, I think George highlighted very well the risks of the U.S., sort of the U.S.-China, competition in that context. I think even before you start talking about body bags, that we could see economic restrictions, we could see unilateral sanctions, we could see other measures that might impair Canadian businesses getting access to their materials. And if you're a business that thinks, oh, I don't import anything directly from China, I'm in the clear, or I don't import from Taiwan, I'm in the clear, that's not the case, right? That's where, maybe something you're buying from Vietnam has components, has chips that are coming from these other countries. And a net result of both tariffs and these other supply chain issues we've been talking about has been a redirection of trade, sort of maybe increasing complexity of trade that we've seen throughout Asia and through other intermediary countries. And so it's something businesses themselves need to use and collect a lot more data about their supply chains and make sure that they're not just buying goods from two different factories that happen to be part of the same supply chain. And so that's something where investing in that data is going to be more important. 10 years ago, maybe if you were in the defense industry, you paid attention to things like export controls. That is not a luxury that people have anymore.
Well, Besma, give some advice to us here, because if you're let's say you're a corporate executive or you're on a board somewhere, and geopolitics is nothing that has ever been on your radar screen or under your consideration as you do your job, how do you even begin to realize we're living in a new world now?
I think really it's a matter of finding geopolitical specialists in your midst. I mean, I think, again, we've brought in ESG folks to help us manage that from before, but now we need to think about geopolitics as part of the C-suite, if you will, that needs to be a part of the expertise we bring into corporations. And I think that really we need to have that geopolitics is not going anywhere because it's much more turbulent, both from the bottom, from the bottom up and from the top down internationally. So I would really advise leaders to think about hiring some geopolitical experts in their midst.
George, I'll give you the last word on this, and/or how well you think the Canadian government is doing and also taking all of this into account.
Well, just first, a shameless plug for my own book. I've now given 2 talks to Canadian pension funds centered around the book and the concepts in the book. And so to Besma's point, if you feel like you're a little bit thin, either at the corporate board level or the senior management C-suite level, you've simply got to get up that curve. Because with respect, I disagree, as you heard a minute ago with Besma, on Trump and Taiwan, but that's the sort of discussion that board absolutely has to have. And Rachel's point is that, some of these supply chains are actually really difficult to get to the bottom of because things show up from places that, are a big surprise. The Canadian government, I don't want to get into a whole big topic about the unseriousness of Ottawa today on, for instance, defense spending. Vis-a-vis Trump, we are going to learn just how unserious we've been when Minister Blair says that, we'll get to the 2% NATO threshold. You've got to spend 2% of your GDP on defense. We'll get there by 2032. Something tells me that the new administration in Washington is not going to be satisfied with that answer. So unfortunately, Canada is going to get, I think, a very rude awakening on this.
Thanks so much to George Takash, Senior Fellow at the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary History at the U of T. That book, once again, Cold War 2.0, Artificial Intelligence and the New Battle Between China, Russia, and America. Rachel Ziemba, Adjunct Senior Fellow, Center for a New American Security, Lecturer, NYU's Center for Global Affairs, and, of course, Besma Momani, Professor of Political Science, University of Waterloo, Senior Fellow at CIGI. Thanks so much, everyone. That is the agenda for Thursday, November 28th, 2024. Tomorrow, John Michael McGrath and yours truly will be back to discuss Donald Trump's threat of 25% tariffs on Canada and Premier Doug Ford's very concerned response. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.